The hot iron pierced the flesh as screams echoed off the cold dungeon stones. Henry of York felt every muscle fiber tear under the executioner's relentless hammers. His toes, once firm and calloused from his work as a merchant, were now just a bloody mass of shattered bones. But this was only the beginning of 2 full days of agony. The year was 1348, and medieval Europe had turned death into a macabre art of prolonged suffering. If this kind of story deserves to be remembered so that it may never be repeated, support this project by subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment about what shocked you most in this narrative. Medieval justice knew no mercy. In the iron courts of the Middle Ages, the word humane had a different meaning. For those who dared to challenge the established order, break the sacred laws, or simply awaken the fury of the powerful, a catalogue of horrors awaited that surpassed the worst nightmares. Each execution method was carefully planned not just to kill, but to transform death into a spectacle of terror that would forever mark the memory of those who watched. Henry of York was a respected merchant in his small English town. He traded in fine fabrics and spices from the East, maintained a prosperous family, and attended church every Sunday. His life changed drastically when he was accused of evading royal taxes. It didn't matter if the accusation was true or false. Once in the hands of medieval justice, his fate was sealed. The Catherine Wheel awaited Henry in the main square, a massive wooden structure the size of a cart, with thick spokes where they would tie their victims. The executioners were artisans of pain, trained to prolong suffering to the maximum. They knew exactly which bones to break first, what force to apply, how to keep the victim's consciousness intact while systematically shattering their body. Henry was publicly stripped before hundreds of onlookers. Women brought their children to watch, turning the execution into a moral lesson on the consequences of disobedience. The merchant was tied to the wheel with wet ropes that would shrink in the sun's heat, cutting deeper into his skin as the hours passed. The first hammer struck the little toe of his left foot. The bone shattered like a dry twig, and Henry let out a scream that silenced the entire square. But the executioners had barely begun. Methodically, bone by bone, toe by toe, they worked their way up Henry's feet. Each blow was calculated to cause maximum pain without inducing fainting or death. Henry's screams echoed through the narrow city streets. Children ran home with their hands over their ears. Pregnant women moved away, fearing the horror might affect their unborn babies. But most remained, mesmerized by the macabre spectacle. This was how medieval justice worked, through collective terror. The first day passed slowly. Henry lost consciousness several times, but the executioners had ways to bring him back. Cold water to the face, salt in the open wounds, strategic blows that caused pain without aggravating fatal injuries. The goal was to keep him alive and conscious for as long as possible. During the night, Henry was left on the wheel. No food, no water, his shattered bones throbbing with pain. The city's rats drew near, attracted by the smell of blood. Some began to lick his wounds, adding a new dimension of horror to his agony. Henry spent the entire night groaning weakly, unable to scream from exhaustion. On the second day, the executioners resumed where they had left off. Now it was the turn of the shin bones and knees. Each blow resonated through the square like a macabre drum. The crowd had thinned, but the most morbid remained, fascinated by human resilience in the face of extreme pain. Henry began to hallucinate. He called for his wife, his children, begged for forgiveness for crimes he might never have committed. His fragmented mind tried to escape his broken body, but consciousness stubbornly remained. It was as if his very soul refused to abandon that suffering. The executioners reached his hips. The sound of the bones breaking changed in tone, becoming deeper, more final. Henry vomited blood, a sign that internal organs were beginning to be affected by the trauma. But it was not yet the end. The arms awaited their turn. The crowd began to murmur. A few voices rose, pleading for clemency, but they were quickly silenced by the royal guards. The king's justice knew no mercy, and to question the methods was to question the divine authority of the monarch. Henry lived long enough to feel the bones in his arms shatter. When the executioners reached his ribs, his heart finally gave out. But even in death, he remained on the wheel for a full week, rotting under the sun, serving as a warning to anyone who thought of challenging the established order. The sight of Henry's decomposed body profoundly affected the local population. Women began to have constant nightmares. Children refused to play in the square where the wheel remained assembled. Merchants from other towns avoided passing through the region, harming the local economy. But Henry was not the only one to experience the horrors of the Catherine Wheel. Dozens of other victims suffered the same torment. Each execution became more elaborate, more cruel, as if the executioners were competing to see who could prolong the suffering the most. Marcus Toretti met a different but equally terrible fate. The Cornish goldsmith had been accused of forging royal coins, a crime that directly struck at the kingdom's prestige. For him, they reserved the brazen bull, a diabolical invention that transformed human screams into animalistic bellows. The bronze statue had been forged especially for executions. On the outside, it looked like a work of art, a majestic bull in an attacking stance. Inside, it was a hollow torture chamber perfectly designed to accommodate a human body in a fetal position. The entrance was in the animal's abdomen, sealed by a heavy metal door. Marcus was pushed inside the statue while still alive and conscious. The internal space barely fit his adult body, forcing him to remain in an extremely uncomfortable position. His legs were bent against his chest, his arms pressed against his body, his head resting on the cold metal. The true diabolical genius of the brazen bull lay in its acoustics. The statue's mouth had been designed with internal tubes that transformed human screams into sounds resembling bovine bellows. Thus, while Marcus agonized inside, the public heard only the sounds of an animal, creating a psychological dissociation that made the spectacle more palatable to the crowds. The executioners lit a modest fire under the statue's belly. The bronze began to heat up slowly, like a giant pot with Marcus cooking inside. At first, the heat was just uncomfortable. Marcus could still breathe normally, though the air inside the statue began to feel stuffy. As the minutes passed, the metal gradually heated up. Marcus's skin began to sweat profusely. The sweat had nowhere to go, pooling at the bottom of the chamber and creating a hot vapor that made breathing even more difficult. Marcus tried to scream, but his cries came out of the bull's mouth as distorted bellows. The crowd watched the spectacle, fascinated. To them, the bull had come to life, emitting convincing sounds of an animal in agony. Children pointed and laughed, thinking it was some kind of theatrical performance. Only the most attentive adults perceived the macabre reality behind those bellows. The bronze continued to heat up. Marcus's skin began to burn on direct contact with the superheated metal. First, there were just small blisters at the points of greatest pressure, elbows, knees, shoulders. Then, second-degree burns spread over his entire body. The smell of burning flesh began to leak from the statue's orifices. Marcus tried to change position, but the space was too small. Any movement only pressed other parts of his body against the hot metal. He was literally being cooked alive, like a piece of meat in a giant pan. His breathing became labored. The air inside the chamber was too hot for his lungs to process properly. The cruel irony of the brazen bull was that its own inventor had been its first victim. Perillos of Athens created the machine to impress a tyrant, but the ruler decided to test the invention's effectiveness on the creator himself. Perillos died in the same way he had planned for others, discovering in his own flesh the cruelty of his creation. Marcus spent 3 hours inside the bull. In the first hour, he could still move and scream. In the second, his movements became spasmodic and involuntary. In the third, only weak moans escaped the statue's mouth. When they finally opened the door, they found a completely cooked body, with the skin peeling off and the muscles literally shredded by the heat. The audience dispersed in silence. Even the most sadistic were disturbed by the final result. The smell of burned human flesh lingered in the square for days, impregnating the stones and the memories of those who watched. Eleanor Visconti faced a different horror, more intimate and psychological. Accused of witchcraft in London, she was subjected to the head crusher, a device that turned the human skull into a nut being slowly crushed by a giant nutcracker. The apparatus consisted of an iron frame with adjustable screws. The victim's head was positioned between two metal plates, and slowly the executioners turned the gears, increasing the pressure in a controlled manner. The goal was not to kill quickly, but to extract confessions through progressive and unbearable pain. Eleanor was brought to the court still wearing her best clothes. She was a respected woman in the community, known for her skills as a midwife and healer. But these were times of religious paranoia, and any knowledge of medicinal herbs could be interpreted as witchcraft. The inquisitors began with simple questions: name, age, profession, family. Eleanor answered with dignity, maintaining her composure even in the face of the sinister device waiting beside her. But when the questions became more specific about her healing practices, she hesitated. This hesitation was interpreted as a sign of guilt. Her head was placed in the crusher. The iron plates were initially far apart, just lightly touching her temples. Eleanor could still speak normally, breathe without difficulty, and move her eyes. The inquisitors repeated the questions about witchcraft, spells, and pacts with demons. Eleanor denied all the accusations. She explained that her knowledge came from her grandmother, who had learned traditional healing techniques passed down through generations. But her rational explanations did not satisfy the inquisitors. They wanted specific confessions, names of other witches, details of satanic rituals. The first turn of the screw was almost imperceptible, just a slight additional pressure on her temples, like a budding headache. Eleanor blinked a few times but continued to deny the accusations. The inquisitors gradually increased the pressure. The pain intensified. Eleanor began to feel as if her head was being squeezed by a giant, invisible hand. The pressure affected her vision, creating dark spots and flashes of light. Still, she maintained her denials, insisting on her innocence. The executioners continued to turn the screws. Now the pressure was strong enough to cause constant pain. Eleanor moaned softly, but her answers remained consistent. She did not practice witchcraft. She did not know other witches. She had never made demonic pacts. The pressure increased again. Eleanor felt something snap in her jaw. One of her teeth came loose, falling bloody onto the stone floor. The pain was now constant and piercing, as if hot needles were drilling into her skull from the inside. 15 minutes after the torture began, Eleanor gave in. The pain had become unbearable. She began to confess to crimes she had never committed, inventing stories of nocturnal rituals, encounters with demons, spells cast against neighbors, anything to make the crushing pressure stop. But the Inquisitors did not stop. They wanted more details, more names, more confessions. They continued to increase the pressure even after Eleanor had confessed to everything they asked. It was as if the process of torture had taken on a life of its own, independent of any judicial objective. Eleanor's teeth began to shatter one by one. Blood ran from her mouth, staining her clothes. Her vision became blurry due to the intracranial pressure. She began to have difficulty forming coherent words. The pressure continued to increase. Eleanor felt as if her skull would explode at any moment. Her eyes watered constantly, her nose bled, her ears rang with a deafening noise. Her mind began to fragment under the extreme pain. Finally, the bones of her skull began to give way. First came microscopic cracks, then larger fissures. Eleanor was still conscious when she felt her own brain being compressed by the increasing pressure. Her last thoughts were lost in a fog of indescribable pain. When the Inquisitors finally stopped turning the screws, Eleanor's head had been transformed into an unrecognizable mass of crushed bones, blood, and brain tissue. It oozed through the cracks of the device like squeezed fruit pulp. Eleanor died confessing to imaginary crimes. Her last moments of lucidity spent inventing stories of witchcraft to try to lessen her suffering. But even her confessions were not enough to save her from the relentless fury of the head crusher. The methods became increasingly elaborate, increasingly cruel, as if human creativity had found its darkest expression in the art of inflicting suffering. Vladislav Dracul would discover this in the worst possible way, through a technique that turned the human body itself into an instrument of its own destruction. The long impalement required a surgical precision that rivaled the best medical techniques of the time. Vladislav Dracul, a distant cousin of the legendary Vlad, was chosen to demonstrate this macabre art in the most prolonged way possible. The executioners had studied human anatomy specifically for this purpose, knowing exactly how to insert the stake without hitting vital organs that would cause a quick death. The wooden stake had been carefully prepared, smooth enough to penetrate without causing unnecessary lacerations, pointed enough to pierce, but not too sharp to tear. The goal was to create a path through the body that would allow the victim to remain alive and conscious for as long as possible. Vladislav was positioned over the stake. The point entered through his anus with calculated slowness. He screamed as he felt the wood pierce his intestines, but that was only the beginning of an 8-hour journey through his own body. The executioners knew every curve of the intestinal tract, every organ they needed to bypass. The stake followed a tortuous path through his abdomen. The executioners guided it manually, adjusting the angle to avoid the liver, bypass the stomach, and steer clear of the kidneys. Vladislav remained conscious throughout the entire process, feeling every inch of the wood carving a path through his insides. After 2 hours, the stake had passed through his diaphragm and begun to pierce his thoracic cavity. Vladislav coughed up blood, but his lungs still partially functioned. He could breathe, though with increasing difficulty. The pain was indescribable, as if a wooden snake were devouring his body from within. The guards positioned around him completely ignored his desperate pleas for water. His supplications grew weaker as the hours passed, but his consciousness remained cruelly intact. He could feel the stake approaching his heart. He could feel it graze his ribs from the inside. In the 5th hour, the tip of the stake emerged in his throat. Vladislav choked on his own blood mixed with wood fragments. He tried to scream, but only a gurgle came from his mouth. The stake continued its upward path, piercing his palate, passing through the base of his skull. In the 8th hour, the tip of the stake finally emerged from Vladislav's mouth. He was still blinking as the bloody wood appeared between his lips. His body had literally become a human skewer, pierced from end to end by a single piece of wood. Vladislav remained alive for a few minutes after the stake fully emerged. His eyes moved, following the executioner's movements. There was still consciousness behind that gaze, still a person trapped in that mangled body. When he finally died, it was almost a relief. The body was left on display for weeks. The sight was so disturbing that pregnant women began to suffer miscarriages upon passing the site. Nature itself seemed to reject such a monstrosity. Birds refused to land near the body, dogs howled and fled, and even the flies took days to approach. Thomas Kellner faced a different kind of horror in the Iron Maiden. The German merchant was locked in a metal sarcophagus lined with hundreds of strategically placed spikes. Each spike had been positioned with mathematical precision to pierce without causing immediate death. The interior of the Iron Maiden was a labyrinth of needles. The spikes varied in size and position, creating a 3-dimensional map of pain. Some were long enough to pierce deeply, others just scratched the surface. The design forced the victim to remain in a specific position where all the spikes touched the body simultaneously. Thomas was pushed into the sarcophagus while still naked. Immediately, hundreds of metal points pierced his skin. There was not a single position where he could rest without feeling pain. Every movement, every breath, every attempt to adjust only created new points of agony. Blood began to trickle through the small holes at the bottom of the Iron Maiden. Thomas tried to find some form of relief, but it was impossible. The spikes were positioned so that any movement only redistributed the pain, never eliminated it. It was like lying on a bed of needles that adapted to every attempt to escape. During the first hour, Thomas could still scream. His cries echoed through the metallic interior of the sarcophagus, creating a muffled, desperate sound. But the effort of screaming only pressed his body more firmly against the spikes, increasing his suffering. As the hours passed, Thomas began to lose blood from hundreds of small wounds. None were fatal individually, but collectively they drained his life force drop by drop. It was like dying from 1,000 small bites, each one contributing to a slow and inevitable end. On the second night, Thomas began to hallucinate. The blood loss and constant pain fragmented his mind. He started talking to people who weren't there, begging for clemency from invisible executioners. His reality became a confusing mix of memories, hallucinations, and pure agony. When they finally opened the Iron Maiden, they found Thomas completely perforated. His body was covered in hundreds of small holes, as if he had been attacked by a swarm of metallic bees. The blood had formed a pool at the bottom of the sarcophagus, slowly draining through the holes. Isabella Torres experienced being drawn and quartered, a method that transformed animal strength into an instrument of execution. 4 horses were positioned around the square, each tied to one of Isabella's limbs with sturdy ropes. Isabella was laid in the center of the square, her arms and legs stretched in opposite directions. The ropes were tied tightly to her wrists and ankles, then connected to the horses' harnesses. The animals remained calm at first, just keeping the ropes taut enough to completely immobilize Isabella. The first whip on the horses made them take a few steps forward. Isabella felt her limbs being stretched beyond their natural limit. Her shoulders began to ache intensely, forced to bear the weight of her own body being pulled in opposite directions. The horses were whipped again. This time, they pulled harder. Isabella heard and felt her shoulders dislocate with an audible pop that echoed across the square. The pain was instantaneous and unbearable, as if her arms had been torn from their sockets. But the horses did not stop. They continued to pull, now against dislocated joints and stretched ligaments. Isabella screamed as she felt her hips break with the same sound as dry branches snapping. Yet she remained conscious, still able to feel every fiber being stretched to its breaking point. The third whip on the horses was decisive. Isabella felt her limbs being literally torn from her torso. First the arms, then the legs. In a matter of seconds, she went from a whole person to a mutilated torso bleeding in the dust of the square. The most terrible part was that Isabella remained alive for a few minutes after the dismemberment. Her head moved, her eyes blinked, her mouth tried to form words. She could see her own arms and legs being carried away by the horses in opposite directions, leaving trails of blood on the square's stones. Her torso convulsed involuntarily, as if still trying to control limbs that no longer existed. The shock of the dismemberment kept her consciousness active long enough for her to process her own mutilation. When she finally lost consciousness, it was almost a mercy. Peter Sanctus met the last horror on this list through inverted crucifixion. Nailed upside down to a wooden cross, he experienced a slow death by inverted blood pressure and gradual asphyxiation. The inverted position created a unique set of agonies. Blood pooled in Peter's head, causing extreme intracranial pressure. His eyes began to swell almost immediately. The veins in his neck dilated like thick ropes, and his face took on a worrisome reddish color. Peter tried to breathe, but the position made it enormously difficult. His lungs had to work against gravity to expel air, creating a constant sensation of suffocation. Each breath required a conscious and deliberate effort. As the hours passed, the pressure in his head intensified. Peter began to feel as if his head would explode from within. His temples throbbed with a pulsating pain that accompanied each heartbeat. His eyes swelled so much he could barely see. In the 5th hour, Peter began to hallucinate due to the intracranial pressure. He spoke to dead people, prayed in non-existent languages, and begged for water from a sky he couldn't properly see. His fragmented mind tried to process a situation that defied all survival instincts. Breathing became increasingly difficult. Peter gasped like a fish out of water fighting against gravity in the unnatural position. His lungs began to fill with fluid, creating a gurgling sound with each attempt to breathe. By the 12th hour, Peter's face was completely unrecognizable. The swelling had distorted his features until he was a mass of swollen reddish flesh. His eyes had completely disappeared behind swollen eyelids, and his mouth had become just a slit in the distended flesh. Peter died, unable to see the world around him, suffocated by the pressure of his own blood pooled in his head. When he finally expired, it was as if a human balloon had finally burst after hours of increasing pressure. These 7 execution methods represented the pinnacle of medieval cruelty. Each had been developed not just to kill, but to transform death into a spectacle of horror that would forever mark the memories of those who watched. They were tools of psychological terror, as much as physical punishment. The Catherine Wheel was finally banned after dozens of similar executions caused popular revolts. The population simply could not bear the spectacle of bodies being systematically shattered in the main square anymore. The clergy themselves began to question whether such cruelty was compatible with Christian teachings. The brazen bull was abandoned for being considered excessively inhumane, even by medieval standards. The irony of turning human screams into animalistic bellows created a dissociation that disturbed even the most hardened executioners. Several executioners refused to operate the device after witnessing its effects. The head crusher fell into disuse when the inquisitors themselves realized that confessions obtained under torture were completely useless. People would confess to anything to make the suffering stop, making it impossible to distinguish the guilty from the innocent. The method defeated its own judicial purpose. The long impalement was gradually replaced by quicker executions due to the time and resources required for its implementation. Keeping a person alive for 8 hours during the process required medical knowledge and constant supervision that few executioners possessed. The Iron Maiden was banned when religious authorities declared that unnecessarily prolonging human suffering was contrary to Christian principles of mercy. The device was considered a manifestation of pure sadism, without any educational or deterrent purpose. Drawing and quartering was abandoned after several cases where the horses refused to pull, as if the animals themselves rejected participating in such barbarity. Some executions failed completely when the horses simply lay down, refusing to move regardless of the whipping. Inverted crucifixion was forbidden by the Catholic Church for being considered a blasphemous parody of Christ's crucifixion. The inverted religious symbolism created theological implications that disturbed the clergy, regardless of the method's punitive effectiveness. All these methods gradually disappeared from medieval jurisprudence, but not for humanitarian reasons. They were abandoned because they became counterproductive, causing more social problems than they solved. Extreme cruelty began to generate popular revolt, social instability, and questions about the legitimacy of royal power. The legacy of these execution methods remains with us today, not in judicial practices, but in the psychological structures of power and control. The same mentality that created the Catherine Wheel still exists in modern authoritarian regimes that use psychological torture to break individual resistance. The logic behind the head crusher still operates in systems that extract confessions through prolonged psychological pressure. The principle of the brazen bull, transforming human suffering into a spectacle, still works in cultures that normalize public humiliation through social media. The surgical precision of the long impalement has evolved into modern torture techniques that cause maximum pain without leaving physical evidence. The philosophy of the Iron Maiden, inflicting suffering through multiple small aggressions, still operates in contemporary forms of systematic harassment. The symbolic dismemberment of drawing and quartering continues in practices that fragment individual identity until a person loses their sense of self. The disorientation of the inverted crucifixion is still used in interrogation techniques that destroy a victim's perception of reality. The difference is that today these practices operate with greater subtlety, hidden behind technical terminology, bureaucratic protocols, and legal justifications. But the fundamental mentality remains the same: to use suffering as a tool of control, to transform pain into a spectacle, to break individual resistance through systematic cruelty. If this story moved you, share it. The more people know about these horrors of the past, the more prepared we will be to recognize when they try to resurface with new masks in the present.